My name is Ben Cave. I will admit I'm here to learn. I'm learning lots. They're fascinating presentations. I'd like to pick you up on one point that you made, Kelly. Kelly. You said that there's a different culture between disaster response and climate change, which is quite interesting. And my question is, I think we heard a lot about the strategic importance of taking climate change into account. It seems to me what you're talking about, though, are extreme events, extreme weather events, which might be part of climate change, but is not actually. But it's that event which you're responding to. And so, I mean, bluntly, would you be able to say that actually climate change has nothing to do with disaster response?
Climate change has nothing to do with disaster response. Yeah. Next. Why don't you follow that bit? But he's next.
Well, I'm
quickly
speaking direct. Sorry, I'm Ed Carr, USAID. I'm in the same bureau as Erica. I'm the climate change coordinator for the bureau. In one level, I take that point. In another level, I actually think that climate change has quite a lot. I'm starting to get an echo here. Climate change has quite a lot to do with both these disaster responses, but also linking these things all into development more broadly. One of the things we're working on at USAID right now is thinking about how our disaster risk reduction programming might better speak to our climate change adaptation programming to create some sort of better transition from worrying about extreme events, which themselves may or may not be tied to ongoing climate change, but to longer-term planning for things that we know will be tied to ongoing climate change, to link all these kinds of things together. So I think there's a utility to thinking of these things as somehow connected, whether or not an individual event can necessarily be tied to that.
Please go ahead.
I wanted to say, Ben Cave, that
Yep.
if you're going to go to the U.S. Congress and you might want to talk about trying to get money to deal with extreme weather change. So this is part of it is just a euphemism issue that we have to deal with. I've got two questions. I wanted to ask in the first slide with is Eric, what's it? Your first name is Erica. Yeah. You talked about how to integrate assessment across relief, global climate change, and impact assessment. Where, if you've got to start spending money, do you start with relief and then come up with a program for global climate change and then for impact assessment? Or where do you start? Yeah. That's one, and then I have a question for the next presentation.
Let's see, I think does it work? Or I just try to project as well. Concerning where we start, we're trying to figure that out right now, to be honest. There's various different intervention points that we're looking at. One of them relates to the fact to get too close. Thank you. One of them relates to the fact that, as Ed was just noting, and as I did in the presentation, that we have a good 30-year history working in climate variability that we've been able to fund. And actually now there's a lot of, oh geez, what are we going to do in climate change adaptation? I say, we've been doing climate variability adaptation, which is effectively the same. There's, we look at it from the stance of people cannot cope with the current level of climate variability. You cannot say any one specific extreme event is or is not related to climate change. It's all a matter, it's risks, right? It's risk and probability. But in terms of where we begin, this is part of what I'm looking at. Again, I'm an impact professional, but I also am working in the climate change milieu. And so one of the pieces that I want to look at in CEQ, as all of you I'm sure have been hearing, our Council on Environmental Quality is asking USG agencies to begin to build some climate change aspects into our impact assessment. And again, consider the fact that I'm not doing impact assessment for the entire development community within USAID. The impact assessment I do is at that close interface of food security programs, food aid programs, are working with the poorest of the poor, working with the most vulnerable, working really long. Are people familiar with the development to relief continuum idea? The idea that you can have a development program, but it needs to be risk aware. Likewise, you can have an emergency relief program that needs to think longer term. So I work really at that interface between those two. And so as a consequence, I'm going in a very kind of a, let's face it, organizationally bureaucratic sort of a methodology, but say, I know I have this particular food aid program that's doing these types of activities that are at this in-between between humanitarian assistance and development, and I'm trying to strengthen them from a climate change perspective. So the way that I am looking at it is simply by understanding my individual portfolio, as opposed to coming from the top and saying we must integrate this through absolutely everything, because then we do get to this problem of where to beginning. I'm starting looking at home, if you will, looking at my own individual portfolio with which I have responsibility for and some authority over. So I think in that regard, looking at parts of the portfolio for the food security programs that are climate sensitive. And many of our NGOs are already doing climate programming, climate protective programming in their food security programs for Bangladesh, for example, because it just makes complete sense to do so.
My next question was for Jonathan, and he mentioned building back better, which I like. It's really a nice phrase. Having worked with the International Financial Institution for 15 years, one of the programs we had were resources specifically set aside for disaster relief. But the regulations about utilization of these resources required us to bring things back to where they were. And I recall a situation in Tonga, in which they had a cyclone. All of the telephone poles went down, and of course they wanted to bury the telephone lines. Made more sense, but that required an environmental impact assessment, and it required another engineering study, and so these funds could not be used for that purpose. Now what I see in the term building back better is that we've got to have an anticipation that if there is a disaster, extreme weather event, then there will be already engineering designs that will allow us to use funds for more adaptive responses.
Yeah, I want to put up this picture that I mentioned earlier, which kind of visually gets at the heart of it. And I completely understand and agree with what you're saying. And I think part of it is that there's oh, I don't have it on here. Shoot. Damn. All right. There's this idea that building back better has to cost more, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's just about doing things differently, because there's, after a disaster happens, which I'm sure you have experienced, there's just this massive pressure to get the project's done, listen to the community. The community said we wanted our houses here. This is where we've always had our houses. The houses get built there. It turns out it's in a floodplain. 2 months later, there's rains. It gets flooded. Would it have costed more to do something differently in that space? It's a good question. But I think it's really more just about changing the thought process of humanitarian people who are planning projects in the field. The other thing, just to respond to what Ben was saying about the difference between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, is if you're looking at the types of projects that are disaster mitigation projects or that are climate change adaptation projects, even though they're coming from two different programs, they're virtually identical projects. So it just makes sense for them to be talking to each other.
Actually, I think that's a point that Eric made as well.
Yeah.
Climate change. There's actually the statistics show us that the increase in impact of disasters, the more people affected, the more damage. is more correlated with the movement of people into disaster-prone areas than it is with the change in the events. Now that data may change, okay? But we have to recognize, I think it's very important to recognize that climate is not your only problem. And certainly in the United States, the bigger problem we have is people moving into dangerous places. And that's true in Bangladesh, and it's true in Mumbai, and it's true in a lot of other places. So I want to emphasize that climate is not the only, solving the climate problem will not solve the disaster problem. And that's why I gave you that answer. Another question, comments? Okay, we'll go in the back. Back here. There you go.
Hi, my name is Iram Aftab. I'm from Pakistan. And when we're talking about disaster management, and we've just had the floods, and we've seen a lot, I feel that through a disastrous event, one of the key things that we can actually incorporate is the climate change adaptation when we are reconstructing and doing the rehabilitation work in the communities. And with USAID and WWF, which are very, very prominent in a lot of these developing countries, I don't know how much do you all actually incorporate this sort of a scenario or a framework or a thought process with through your organizations in these countries? Because I haven't seen a lot of the USAID people doing a lot of the impact assessments on their projects or heard anything about it. So I just wanted to know on this issue.
Concerning in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, we do have a sticky point within our regulation. It's different from how we do domestic. In domestic environmental compliance, or NEPA, here in the U.S., there are no exemptions for humanitarian, whatever the equivalent of our, FEMA work, basically. There may be delays and things like that, but there are no exemptions. The regulation that USAID has certain exemptions for international disaster assistance. So you will not see those environmental impact assessments being done in that sort of quote-unquote hot zone of the immediate disaster response. That's when we rely on things like the SPHERE guidance for the minimum technical guidance for humanitarian assistance. For our longer term and our transition programs, we do. This is, I can't really speak too much into details, but this is something that AID is exploring in terms of the effectiveness. But that's about all I can say about that right now.
Okay. I don't know if this, there we go. The thing I'll add, in Pakistan in particular, WWF does have a presence there, and yeah, we're working with IUCN to do some green recovery and reconstruction after the flooding that happened. So we are starting to do this. It's just, in disaster situations, it takes time to kind of get people deployed and get it. But WWF has. We have funding to send an environment advisor to Pakistan to start working on some of these issues. But I mean, to the extent that we can do training amongst our own staff and training among the people on the ground, that'll take us a certain distance, and then it also requires engagement with the other reconstruction actors that are out there too.